There are old stories, stories so ancient that time itself no longer remembers their beginnings. Stories that wander through the world like tired travelers, stopping only where someone listens with a quiet heart. Tonight I will tell you one of these stories. A story about a lantern that remembers, and the man who carried it through centuries of wandering dusk. Settle in. Let your breath soften. Let your thoughts loosen. The story moves slowly, the way an old wizard grandfather walks in deep snow. Careful, gentle, unhurried. Long ago, though not so long that memory cannot reach it, there was a watchman. He walked the forgotten roads, wrapped in a cloak the color of old parchment. His beard curled like threads of smoke, and his eyes held the faint shimmer of things that didn't exist anymore. Not the past, not the future. Something between. People said he walked paths that only appeared when the night was deep enough to remember them. They whispered this from behind shutters, always softly, as if his lantern could hear. Ah, yes, the lantern. It was a strange thing. Never bright, never warm. Its flame flickered with the trembling of a hesitant memory, forming and dissolving, forming again. Sometimes it glowed steady. Sometimes it pulsed, slow and rhythmic, like a tired heart. And sometimes the flame cast shadows that didn't match anything around it. Shadows that stretched too far. Shadows that didn't stretch at all. Shadows that swayed, gently, as if listening. Children in the villages said that the lantern didn't just shine. It remembered. It remembered moments long faded, lives long finished, roads long erased. They believed the watchman could raise the lantern and see history living quietly in its pale glow. And maybe, perhaps, the lantern remembered those who looked into it as well. That was why the watchman always angled the lantern slightly downward. Not enough to hide the path, just enough to keep others safe. Most of the time. On a winter evening, frost lay over the world like a thin sheet of glass. The watchman reached an ancient crossroads, so old that even the earth beneath it seemed to whisper with forgotten footsteps. The lantern trembled in his hand, a soft shiver, like something waking. It pointed toward a road that had no traces of life, no footprints, no wagon tracks, only the suggestion of a path, existing purely because the lantern remembered it. And so the watchman followed. Mist curled along the path. It moved like quiet breath, in and out, in and out, brushing against the watchman's legs. The lantern's glow revealed shapes, faint at first, then clearer. The outlines of buildings that no longer stood, beams of collapsed houses, fences eaten by centuries, doorways that led nowhere. Yet here, in the lantern's memory, they were whole. And the world around them seemed to sigh with recognition. The first figure appeared near a well, an old woman drawing water with the steadiness of someone who had done it all her life. The rope creaked in time with her slow pull. But as the watchman passed, Her movements did not pause. She did not see him. She did not hear him. Her face was turned away, and yet her shadow on the wall turned its head toward the watchman. Just slightly. Just enough. As he continued down the road, the old woman kept drawing water, but her shadow remained facing him long after he'd walked past. The watchman sighed softly. He had seen things like this many times. The lantern's memories were not always perfect. They were frayed at the edges, unfinished in places, like old tapestries with missing threads. When the lantern tried to remember a person fully but couldn't, their shadows behaved strangely. Their faces blurred. Their movements became echoes of echoes. Not harmful, not alive, just incomplete. Further along stood a small mill. The memory of a millstone turned inside it, steady and slow. The miller, a round man with soft shoulders, leaned close to the wooden boards, speaking to them as if they could answer. The watchman knew this memory well. The miller always spoke with the mill, always told it about the seasons, the harvest, the gossip of unseen neighbors. Tonight, though, something spoke back. A low, deep murmur coming from within the mill, not words, not anything meant for human ears. The miller smiled, warm and comfortable, as if he had been waiting for that answer a long time. The watchman's lantern dimmed, softly, cautiously. Past the mill, the memory road widened. Stone by stone, the lantern rebuilt a marketplace that had been dust for centuries. Stalls flickered into existence. Cloth awnings waved in a breeze no one else could feel. Voices murmured, too distant to understand. People appeared, but not fully. Faces without eyes, figures without hands, bodies that walked with gentle movements, unfinished and harmless, but caught in loops they would never escape. The lantern struggled here. Its flame fluttered, trying to remember 100 lives at once. And the watchman slowed his steps, letting it breathe. He whispered, softly, "Easy now, old friend, easy, easy. Remember only what you can." The lantern steadied a little. Its glow softened. The unfinished people drifted back into the mist, relieved, as if released from a long-held breath. The watchman continued. At the end of the marketplace stood the Tower of Echoes, tall, cracked, leaning slightly, like an ancient violin left too long in the rain. The lantern dimmed again, not from strain this time, but from reluctance. It never liked remembering this place. And yet, this was the watchman's path. He always returned here. He always climbed the tower, because something waited at the top. Something he could not abandon. Inside the tower, the air was thick with dust. Every step stirred memories, long-cooled embers glowing briefly beneath his feet. The walls whispered, not words, just the soft sigh of remembered grief. The watchman ascended the spiral staircase, round and round, slow and steady. Each step echoed. Each echo came back a little softer, and a little later, and sometimes, just sometimes, with one extra footstep that did not belong to him. He did not turn around. He never did. At the top of the tower stood a small wooden table, and upon it, a child's toy horse. Simple, carved from pale wood, the edges worn smooth by small hands long gone. The watchman reached out. His fingers trembled, not from age, but from memory. He whispered. The night was thick, like dark wine, and each step of the watchman sounded different than it would in the daytime, deeper, as if the stones remembered not only the steps, but the purpose behind them. He walked slowly, because speed would break the threads of memory, and because the lantern in his hand demanded delicate handling. Its warmth in his palm was not only from metal or oil, but from habit, from duty, and from the knowledge that sometimes the light itself became the only witness. The wind barely blew, the fog draped low, curling beneath his boots, and all the surrounding silence lived on a fine, thin frequency. Within it, echoes could be heard, distant water, the weight of doors, whispers that could easily be mistaken for one's own memory. The watchman rarely spoke aloud, but on nights like this he whispered, not to anyone, but to test that he could still form words. "May they rest," he murmured to himself, and saying it eased both the lantern and his own breath. The first thing he encountered deep in the northern forest was silence, pierced by a soft, almost imperceptible rustle. It was not wind nor leaves, but the skin of an old world, lightly cracking in the cold. Between the tree trunks, shadows flickered, but they did not hurry. They existed in halftones. Sometimes it seemed as if someone moved the moment he looked away. When he looked, the movement stopped and froze into strange, still poses. He saw a child standing by a fallen trunk. The child did not shiver, did not freeze, did not breathe harder. He simply stood, as if carved from the same material as the night fog. The child's head tilted slightly, as though listening to music only he could hear. His shadow stretched unnaturally long, as if time itself had pulled it behind him. The watchman stopped, staring, and felt, not with his eyes, but with attention, that someone or something observed him from the direction of the child, and this gaze lingered longer than he usually preferred. "Go calmly," he whispered softly, and the figure dissipated like steam. Yet an echo of its presence remained in his chest, a gentle unease that could not be touched. The forest grew denser, and the path beneath him became sensation rather than root, soft and shifting beneath his boots. Tree trunks were covered with old bark, like dry skin. When he ran his hand over one, he felt delicate grooves, as if ancient scars were etched there. The scents were of damp moss, wet earth, and, somewhere faintly, the bitterness of long extinguished fires. These smells conjured fragments of memories best savored slowly. Women walking with baskets, a miller rushing across a bridge, birds locking their nocturnal songs in their feathers. He allowed himself pauses, and at each stop, small events unfolded. A spider web quivered, and in its tremble a face flashed. A drop of water fell from a branch, and for a moment revealed a miniature street scene from the past. someone laughing, unaware they had long since gone. These fragments demanded no action, only recognition. See me, speak my name within yourself, and I may vanish into the fog. The watchman muttered their names softly, sometimes barely audible, and memory, acknowledged, seemed to ease its burden, drifting away in mist. At one pause, he heard a voice, not human, not melodic, but like a finger sliding along the edge of a bowl. The voice spoke no words, only reminded him of a word from childhood, a cat's name long forgotten. This mingling of the familiar and the unknown brought a strange, painful softness to his chest. He looked around, but behind him was only the path, and in the silence, breath was audible, not his own. It was the breath of an old house. He stepped forward, and in a clearing he saw a group of figures that on an ordinary night might appear normal. An old man with a staff, a weaver, a woman with a child tucked at her side. But now their movements were unsteady, as if memory tried to pass through another body and could not find its form. The weaver pulled a thread, but her shadow pulled a different one, creating a tiny rift through which cold seeped. The old man turned, his eyes empty, not because blind, but because they had seen too much. He approached an old house, one of those by the road whose green windows seemed like watching eyes. The roof sagged like a tattered hat, gray with dust. The door stood slightly ajar, creaking as if someone always breathed behind it. His lantern cast a warm circle of light, and within it everything was honest. A stool, a table with a dust-covered cup, and on the table a small carved horse, its mane worn, dusty but intact. The watchman picked it up carefully, and in his hand it felt heavy, not from wood, but because within it lived the memory of hands that once held it. He remembered his own childhood, holding a similar toy, how his mother scolded him for mischief and then smiled when he hid beneath blankets. The memory was warm, comforting, yet when he looked into the window, his reflection smiled, not in sync with him, but delayed, like old clocks lag behind. The reflection smiled, blinked, and in its eyes flickered something alien, a foreign melancholy. The watchman lowered his gaze, unwilling to meet his reflection, and returned the horse to its place, as if repaying a debt. He sat at the table, holding the cup in both hands, letting thoughts flow slowly, thick as milk, and within each the faint anxiety that had become a constant companion. He reflected on how thin the line was between memory and imagination, how often the lantern revealed a deceased face as that of someone recently alive, and he asked himself whether memory ever grew tired. Perhaps, he thought, memory sometimes wishes to be reborn, but does not know what form to take. In that desire, it distorts images, borrowing fragments to complete a whole. Sometimes this succeeds, and the figure departs gracefully, sometimes not, and a scar remains, a sense of wrongness that becomes familiar and begins to influence the living nearby. This awareness weighed on him, yet it was not deadly. It compelled him to move forward like a ship guided by an ancient star. At last he reached a small chapel on the hill, and among the ruins he saw several figures sitting on the ground. Their postures were familiar, like prayer, but their faces were distorted, as if someone had tried to paste faces from another era in the wrong place. They whispered to each other without sound, exchanging glances that found no reply. One man raised his hand and looked directly at the watchman. In his empty eyes flickered understanding. He saw him. Not hostility, but fatigue with insistence, a silent plea. The watchman knelt. He felt the lantern's light pull strongly inward, as if wanting to heal the faces that had been fragmented. He placed his palm on the metal. It was cold, yet a wave of warmth spread, small, gentle, comforting. The figures quieted, like a flock of birds gathering for a moment. Gradually, one by one, they began to melt, not abruptly, not with a scream, but slowly, like evening fading. Their faces were not fully restored, yet relief lingered. Memory had allowed them to part. And then, the square where he and his friend once ran along narrow streets lay empty, like a faded painting. In the light of the lantern, a figure appeared. It moved slowly, almost dissolving into the mist. The watchman's heart trembled as he recognized the features. It was his friend, Elias, the one with whom he had shared childhood secrets. But Elias's face, it resembled a memory carved out of a dream. His eyes were hollow, as if not a spark of warmth or life remained inside. "Elias," he whispered, but his voice sounded oddly foreign in this emptiness. The shadow of Elias did not answer, did not smile, did not move towards him. Where he and his friend once ran along narrow streets lay empty, like a faded painting. In the light of the lantern, a figure appeared. It moved slowly, almost dissolving into the mist. The watchman's heart trembled as he recognized the features. It was his friend, Elias, the one with whom he had shared childhood secrets. But Elias's face, it resembled a memory carved out of a dream. His eyes were hollow, as if not a spark of warmth or life remained inside. "Elias?" the watchman whispered, but his voice sounded oddly foreign in this emptiness. The shadow of Elias did not answer, did not smile, did not move toward him. It simply existed, flat, cold, with a faint tremor, like smoke that had once been fire. The watchman felt a tightening in his chest. He understood this was not his friend. It was merely an echo of the past, a shell of memory, trapped in the labyrinth of the city and the lantern. Around him, silence, only the rain tapping softly on the stones, and he realized that the footsteps he had heard before were illusions of memory. The lantern flickered, as if pointing the way, but now the path led not to comfort, but to the realization of his own vulnerability. Even the closest friend could become a shadow, and step by step he must walk forward alone. Elias moved away, dissolving into the air, and the watchman watched as his silhouette spread across the cobblestones, until only emptiness and cold remained. The watchman lowered his eyes, feeling something inside him die along with the shadow of Elias. The night stretched around him again, thick, like a living blanket, and every sound, every rustle, seemed both familiar and alien at once. He stepped forward, realizing that ahead lay not just a labyrinth of streets, but of his own memories, where every stone held the shadow of someone who would never return. And the lantern drew him deeper, toward answers he was not yet ready to face.
He walked slowly, as if each step could awaken something better left asleep. The walls around him trembled faintly, like the breath of an ancient city that remembered everything and could forget nothing. The stone beneath his feet radiated a cold that seeped into his bones, but it did not hurt. It simply reminded him that there was no ordinary warmth here. The shadows around him thickened and stretched, taking the shapes of people he knew but could never fully recall. Their movements were slow, almost meditative, yet each shadow radiated that emptiness left in the chest by encounters with what could never be reclaimed. He saw echoes of old friends, familiar silhouettes of parents, passers-by from the streets of his childhood, but everything was distorted. Faces shifted, eyes flickered in the wrong places, smiles trembled as if on the verge of vanishing. For a moment, it seemed to him that one of the silhouettes had stopped and was looking directly at him. He recognized the figure, Elias, but now even more distant, even colder. He walked slightly behind, and each of his steps caused a subtle trembling in the air, as if the city itself reacted to his presence. The watchman felt a strange mixture of longing and unease. It was not a threat, but an untouchable knowledge that the past was already dead, and the memory of it still clung to the edge of the world. He raised his lantern higher, and the light trembled, casting hundreds of reflections on the wet stone. Within the reflections flickered images that belonged to no time. A boy sitting on the pavement with a doll, a woman with a basket at the market, an old man leading a horse down a street that had long ceased to exist. They did not move in reality, but their gazes reached toward him, demanding acknowledgement, as if only his recognition of their existence allowed them to live, even for a moment. Suddenly, the silence was replaced by a barely audible sound, a soft knock like distant footsteps, yet with a clear rhythm. He froze, listening. The steps repeated, but carried no weight. They seemed both near and far, like sounds traveling through water. He realized it was not an ordinary sound, but an echo of memory, as if someone walked through his own childhood, warped by time and distance. The fog around him thickened, forming half-tones and silhouettes that defied reason. One gradually emerged, a tall figure in a long coat, face hidden beneath a hood. It walked not toward the watchman, but along the wall, gliding as if not touching the ground. The watchman felt cold, but not fear, rather a deep understanding that each step was a dialogue with something that could not be embraced or held. Then a whisper came from the mist, barely audible, yet familiar. It was a voice that could belong only to him, soft, penetrating directly into his consciousness, speaking not with words, but with memories. He understood that the path ahead would become even more entangled. Each turn would demand acknowledgement, each face recognition. He walked ever deeper, and the further he went, the less difference there was between the streets and his memories. At first, he thought it was an old city, full of shadows that remembered the past, but gradually a strange feeling arose, that the city was responding to him, as if every street, every door, every window adapted to his thoughts. He stopped, looked around, and in the misty darkness it seemed as if he could hear his own words whispered back behind him. He noticed that the faces of familiar figures repeated too often. The woman with the basket, the same one he had seen on the square a few minutes ago, the boy with the doll, was again sitting on the pavement in the exact same pose. He blinked, and they changed places, their expressions shifting, smiles trembling and disappearing. At first, he attributed it to the fog, to a nocturnal illusion, but a subtle feeling of dread grew. Then he noticed the strangest thing. His own reflection in an old puddle. It moved out of sync with him. He raised his hand, and the reflection raised its hand a moment later. He blinked again, and the reflection smiled at him with a foreign smile. A sharp, unpleasant thought arose. What if the city is me? At first he dismissed it, thinking it madness, but then the details began to form a terrifying mosaic. Every familiar face, every step, every whisper, like pieces of his memory, fragments of his life, preserved somewhere inside his mind. He stopped in the square where he once played with his friend, and suddenly realized every street is his thought, every shadow is his fear, every figure is an echo of his own personality. And at that instant came a sudden, almost shocking revelation. It is not the city that holds him, but he who holds the city. All the streets, shadows, memories, this is a trap he himself created, with no way out. His chest tightened, his breath became uneven, but the most horrifying moment was when he saw her, his wife. The lantern flared, and the figure appeared right before him. She was familiar, but not alive. Her eyes were empty, her face cold, her breath absent. He understood that everything he had loved, all memories of her, were only part of this trap. And now every alley, every dark lane, every whisper, it was him playing with his own memory, testing himself to the limit, with no chance of escape. Only in that moment, as terror reached its peak, did the Watchman realize that the loneliness and cold were not external. They had always been inside him. The fog thickened around him, heavy and viscous, curling around his boots and climbing his legs like pale fingers. Each breath he drew was damp with it, and each step he took seemed to echo not outward, but inward, as if the sound was absorbed into something vast and waiting beneath the streets. The city no longer felt like stone and wood. It was soft, fluid, reshaping itself with every thought that passed through him. He tried to walk, but the streets curved in impossible ways. Alleys he had known as a boy twisted into new forms. Doorways opened into corridors that should not exist,
Staircases led to walls, and bridges arched over nothingness. The fog swallowed the lantern's light, leaving only vague shapes and shadows that slid across the pavement, whispering in tones he almost recognized. And then a realization, sudden and unbearable. This city was not the city of the living. It had emerged after her death, wrought from grief and memory. Every corner, every narrow street, every echoing footstep was a fragment of his mourning, crystallized into architecture. He remembered the night he buried her, the rain on the stone, the cold pressing into his chest, the silence so complete that it had felt like the end of the world. It had not been the end. It had been the beginning of this. He stumbled through a plaza, and there she was, at the far edge, bathed in pale lamplight, not alive, not moving as she had, but present, an apparition that held the exact shape of memory. The shadows twisted around her, as if the fog itself bowed in recognition. Her eyes, however, were empty hollows, dark and infinite, reflecting everything she had tried to forget. He whispered, "Anna," voice cracking. The fog absorbed it, turning it inward, back to him, until he felt as though he was the one being observed by himself. She did not move toward him. She did not smile. She was not Anna anymore. Not truly. She was the embodiment of all his regrets, all the love that had turned into longing, all the warmth that death had stolen and memory had imprisoned. The streets around him began to ripple like liquid reflections. Each memory of her that he had cherished, the laughter in the morning, the brush of her hand against his shoulder, the quiet voice in the dark, was distorted, repeating over and over, fragmenting. He realized that he had built this city for her, but it had imprisoned him instead. Each step forward was an attempt to reach her. Each glance backward revealed only another copy, another memory twisting in the fog. Panic, cold and creeping, seeped into him. He could feel his own heartbeat echoing against the walls, as if the city itself were a drum of his terror. Yet it was not mere fear. It was recognition. The city was alive only because he carried it in himself. Every alley was a thought, every shadow a choice, every fog-drenched courtyard a regret. The watchman was trapped in his own mind, in a labyrinth of memory constructed by grief and guilt, and the walls whispered his name with every gust of wind. He moved forward slowly, every step weighted by realization. The lantern flickered, throwing shadows that became faces he once knew, voices he once heard, moments he had tried to forget. And there, at the center of the labyrinth, standing beneath a spire of black mist, he saw her again. She was no longer the wife he loved. She was a statue of absence, the perfect echo of the living she had been, and the living he could never reclaim. The fog pressed against him, cold and absolute. He understood fully this city, these memories, the shadows, the whispers, the figures, were all extensions of his grief. The watchman was walking in a maze of himself, a trap built by the mind of a man who could not let go. And as he looked at her, he realized that she had been dead long before this place existed. But only now, in this fog, did he truly see that he had been following the echoes of his own loss all along. He fell to his knees. The lantern trembled in his hand, and for a moment the fog seemed to lean closer, listening. He wanted to call to her, to beg her to return, to demand a way out, but the words died in his throat. There was no way out. The city was him. The fog was him. The shadows were him. And the only thing that remained was her empty gaze, a mirror of his soul, cold and unforgiving. He reached toward her, and the moment his fingers brushed the mist, the streets shifted again. Every familiar corner, every cobbled lane, every whispering shadow converged into one truth. He was lost inside himself, and there was no one to guide him but the remnants of
The fog thickened around him, heavy and viscous, wrapping his legs and climbing up his trousers like pale fingers. Every breath was filled with moisture. Every step resonated inwardly, as if the sound were absorbed by something immense hidden beneath the streets. The city no longer seemed of stone and wood. It had become soft, fluid, shifting with every thought passing through him. He tried to move, but the streets bent impossibly. Alleyways he had known since childhood twisted into new shapes. Doors opened into corridors that shouldn't exist. Staircases led into walls, and bridges arched over emptiness. The fog swallowed the lantern light, leaving only vague forms and shadows gliding over the pavement, whispering in tones he almost recognized. And then realization came, sudden and unbearable. This city was not of the living. It had arisen after her death, woven from grief and memory. Every corner, every narrow street, every echo of steps was a fragment of his sorrow, crystallized into architecture. He remembered the night he buried her, the rain on stone, the cold pressing on his chest, the silence, full to the end, seeming like the end of the world. But it was not the end. It was the beginning of this. He stumbled onto the square, and there, at the edge of light, she stood, in the pale glow of the lantern, not alive, not moving as before, but present, a ghost holding the exact shape of memory. Shadows curled around her, as if the fog itself bowed in recognition. But her eyes, empty voids, dark and infinite, reflected everything he had tried to forget. "Anna?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The fog engulfed him, turning inward, back toward him, and he felt that he was being watched through himself. She did not move toward him. She did not smile. She was no longer Anna, not truly. She was the embodiment of all his regrets, of all the love turned to longing, of all the warmth death had stolen and memory had imprisoned. The streets around him began to ripple like liquid reflections. Every memory of her that he had kept, morning laughter, the touch of a hand on a shoulder, a quiet voice in the dark, distorted, repeated, and fell apart into fragments. He realized that he had created this city for her, but he had trapped himself. Every step forward was an attempt to reach her. Every glance backward showed only another copy, another memory twisted in the fog. A cold, creeping terror filled him.
He could feel his own heartbeat echoing off the walls, as if the city itself were a drum of his anxiety. But it was not merely fear. It was a realization. The city existed only because he carried it within himself. Every alley was a thought, every shadow a choice, every courtyard soaked in fog a regret. The watchman was trapped in his own mind, in a labyrinth of memory built from grief and guilt, and the walls whispered his name with every gust of wind. He moved forward slowly, each step laboring under the weight of understanding. The lantern trembled, casting shadows that turned into familiar faces, voices, moments he had tried to forget. And there, in the center of the labyrinth, under a spire of black fog, he saw her again. She was no longer the wife he had loved. She was a statue of absence, a perfect echo of the living, the one she had been, and the one he could never bring back. The fog pressed on him, cold and absolute. He understood fully. This city, these memories, the shadows, the whispers, all were extensions of his grief. The watchman wandered within his own mind, trapped in a prison built by a man who could not let go. And when he looked at her, he realized that she had died long before this city had appeared. But only now, in this fog, did he see that all along he had been following the echo of his own loss. He sank to his knees. The lantern trembled in his hand, and for a moment the fog seemed to lean closer, listening. He wanted to call to her, to beg her to return, to demand a way out, but the words stuck in his throat. There was no exit. The city was him. The fog was him. The shadows were him. And all that remained was her empty gaze, a mirror of his soul, cold and merciless. He reached out to her, and in the moment his fingers touched the fog, the streets shifted once more. Every familiar corner, every paved road, every whispering shadow converged into one truth. He was lost inside himself, and only the remnants of memory could guide him.
He wandered deeper, and the city itself began to twist into impossible forms. Alleyways folded back upon themselves, like the pages of a book being rewritten. Bridges looped into infinity, and every doorway opened into another memory, not a place, but a fragment of thought. The fog thickened into a viscous sea, swallowing sound and light, leaving only the lantern's trembling glow to guide him. Yet even that light revealed not reality, but echoes of himself, distorted, multiplying, collapsing into each other like reflections in a shattered mirror. Every shadow he passed became dual. A figure of a child mirrored the man he had been. A mother's face carried the shape of his own grief. Even the cobblestones beneath his feet seemed to pulse with memories not entirely his, yet undeniably part of him. The city was no longer just a city. It was a mind, a living labyrinth, and he was both prisoner and cartographer. The more he walked, the more he realized that escape was impossible. Each turn, each step, led not outwards, but further inwards. And the faces he encountered were never wholly separate. They were the same eyes he had seen in mirrors, the same hands that once held him, the same smiles that had abandoned him long ago. The past and present collided, doubling endlessly, like a pair of overlapping moons reflecting one another. The two moons hung in the fog above, pale and silent, their light falling not on streets, but on the memories themselves, illuminating mistakes, regrets, and moments lost. They were twins, twin witnesses to all that had passed and all that had never been resolved. Then he saw her again, Anna, but now, as before, she was both there and not there. One half of her seemed to look at him with a tenderness he remembered, but the other half was hollow, reflecting only accusation. The twin moons cast a glow on her form, splitting her into two figures, one alive in memory, the other dead in truth. And Watchman understood that the city, the labyrinth, the fog, they were all born from his inability to reconcile these two versions of reality. He fell to his knees, clutching the lantern. The twin moons glimmered above, casting long shadows that converged into shapes he recognized as himself. Every step he had taken, every alley he had passed, every echo of her voice, every whisper of the fog, they were threads of his own guilt, woven into architecture he could not dismantle. The labyrinth was not just a place, it was a sentence, eternal wandering, eternal witnessing, eternal remembering. He reached out to her, begging, murmuring apologies, confessing every forgotten word, every ignored feeling, every moment he had turned away. And for an instant her hollow hand trembled. The twin moons shimmered, and for a heartbeat it seemed he could reach through the fog and grasp reality itself. But the city resisted. The streets twisted again. Doors vanished, alleys stretched into infinity. His apologies bounced off walls that were his own mind, dissolving into nothing. The lantern flickered, casting twin shadows of himself on the ground, one tall, upright, burdened with grief, the other collapsed, twisted, almost merging with the shadows of the city. They mirrored him endlessly, like a cruel echo of every choice he had ever made. The moons above reflected not light, but consequence, and there was no escape. Every attempt to move forward brought him back to himself. Every attempt to call her name fragmented into echoes of his guilt. Finally, he understood fully. The labyrinth had no exit. It had been built from love and loss, from memory and mourning, and it held him now as tightly as it had held every shadow of the city. The twin moons, the dual figures, the fog, the echoing streets, all of it was a testament to his inability to release what he could not forgive, himself. And in that realization, as he knelt in the cold, fluid city, the two moons mirrored in the puddles at his feet, he saw the ultimate truth. He would never leave. The labyrinth was not outside, it was inside, and every breath, every step, every flicker of the lantern was proof that he belonged to it now. And above him, Anna's hollow gaze, split between love and accusation, watched silently. The twin moons hung over the labyrinth, eternal, unmoving, witnesses to the prison he had forged from his own heart. The city whispered his name, the fog enveloped him completely, and he understood. He had wandered too far into memory, and memory, relentless and eternal, would never let him go.
The labyrinth gradually grew quiet. The fog sank almost to the ground,
and two pale, silent moons reflected in the countless puddles and cracks in the pavement. The watchman remained alone among the streets, which now seemed both familiar and alien, as if the city itself was holding its breath, observing what he had done. He sank onto the cold stone, the lantern trembling in his hands, reflecting his exhaustion and helplessness. Inside him there was no longer any hope of finding a way out. Every door was an illusion. Every turn led back to the beginning, back to himself. He realized fully this city, the fog, the whispers, they were not the external world, but his own heart, embodied in the architecture of memory and grief. Then he heard her voice, soft, gentle, penetrating directly into his consciousness. Anna. But this was not the wife he had loved. It was her memory, manifested in shadows and light, in the breath of the fog. She did not approach him, did not speak, but her empty gaze still watched, mixing love and reproach. The watchman closed his eyes and finally allowed his tears to flow. He asked for forgiveness, not for the city, not for the fog, but for all those moments when he had forgotten her in life, for his inability to be there when it mattered most. He whispered her name, and the whisper of the fog echoed his words, fading into infinity. The two moons hung over the labyrinth, motionless and cold, reflecting his eternal confinement. Two figures, his tall, upright reflection of guilt, and a twisted shadow, almost merging with the city, were now his only companions. The city whispered his name. The fog enveloped him completely, and he realized memory is a prison he had locked himself into. The watchman no longer tried to escape. He let grief and guilt flow through him, dissolving into every stone, every alley, every whisper. Anna stood beside him, torn between love and reproach, a witness to a silent sentence. He would remain in this city forever, in this labyrinth built from his own heart and memory. And somewhere in the distance, in the light of the two moons, the city breathed quietly with him, like a living memory that would never die.